In 1947, a border was drawn across South Asia. And almost overnight, millions of people discovered that the place they called home was no longer on their side of the border. More than 14 million people would eventually be uprooted. Muslims moving toward Pakistan, Hindus and Sikhs moving toward India. Entire families leaving behind homes, land, businesses, and communities they had known for generations. This wasn't ordinary migration. It was a mass movement driven by fear, violence, and the sudden division of a country. And within months, one of the largest migrations in human history had transformed the lives of millions forever. But how did a line drawn on a map become a catastrophe of this scale? And why did so many people have to run from the only home they had ever known? Before India and Pakistan existed as separate countries, there was British India. For almost 2 centuries, the British Empire controlled a vast and extraordinarily diverse part of South Asia. Millions of Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, Christians, and other communities lived across the same territory. They spoke different languages, followed different traditions, and belonged to different political and regional identities. But for much of this period, they were living within the same imperial system. Then, during the 20th century, the demand for independence became impossible for Britain to ignore. 2 of the most important political forces were the Indian National Congress and the All India Muslim League. And among the leaders at the center of this struggle were Mahatma Gandhi and Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Gandhi imagined an independent India where different religious communities could continue living together. Jinnah increasingly argued that Muslims needed stronger political safeguards, and eventually came to support the creation of a separate Muslim homeland. The disagreement was not simply about religion. It was about something much bigger. Who would control the future of South Asia after the British left? As British power weakened, political negotiations became increasingly difficult. Communal tensions grew, and the idea of a single independent India became harder for the major political parties to agree upon. By the 1940s, the question was no longer simply, when will Britain leave? It was becoming, what will this country look like when they do? And that question would soon turn a political dispute into a decision that would redraw one of the most populated regions on Earth. By the end of the Second World War, Britain was no longer in a position to hold India indefinitely. The British economy was weakened. Political pressure for independence was growing, and the demand for self-rule had become impossible to ignore. So Britain prepared to leave. But leaving India meant answering one enormous question. Would the country become one independent nation? Or would it be divided? By 1947, the political gap between Congress and the Muslim League had become extremely difficult to bridge. Muhammad Ali Jinnah argued that Muslims needed their own homeland. Congress leaders, including Jawaharlal Nehru, ultimately accepted partition as the political path toward independence, even though the consequences were deeply uncertain. Then Britain made the decision. India would be divided. 2 new countries would emerge, India and Pakistan. But there was one enormous problem. Nobody had yet drawn the exact border. So Britain turned to a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe. He had never worked in India before. Yet he was given the extraordinary task of drawing a boundary across one of the most densely populated regions on Earth. And he had only a matter of weeks to do it. The new boundary cut through villages, farmland, roads, railways, and communities that had existed for generations. But the people living there did not immediately know where the final line would fall. Then, in August 1947, India and Pakistan became independent, and only afterward did millions discover which side of the new border they were actually on. The map had changed, but the people hadn't, and now, millions of them were about to move. Once the border became reality, the movement began. People who had lived in the same towns for generations suddenly found themselves on the wrong side of a new international boundary. Millions began moving. Muslim families headed toward Pakistan. Hindu and Sikh families moved toward India. And this wasn't a few thousand people crossing a border. It was an enormous movement of entire communities. Families packed whatever they could carry. Some traveled by road. Some walked for days. Others crowded onto whatever trains and transport they could find. In Punjab, the movement was especially dramatic. Entire villages emptied. Homes were abandoned. Fields that had been farmed for generations were suddenly left behind. And the movement wasn't happening in just one direction. As Muslims moved west toward Pakistan, Hindus and Sikhs were moving east toward India. The roads and railway networks became channels carrying people away from places they had once considered home. And the numbers kept growing. Estimates vary depending on how migration is counted, but more than 14 million people were displaced during the partition period. That makes it one of the largest forced migrations ever recorded. Imagine taking millions of people and moving them across a brand new border. Within a matter of months, cities changed, villages changed, entire regions changed. A person could leave their home in the morning and arrive somewhere completely unfamiliar, surrounded by people who had also lost almost everything. But there was another problem. The new border didn't create safety. In many places, it created fear. Rumors spread. Communities became suspicious of one another. And as the movement grew, the journey itself became increasingly dangerous. What had begun as a massive migration was now turning into a struggle simply to survive. The people moving across the new border were already leaving behind almost everything they knew. But in many places, the journey itself became deadly. As communities began to fear attacks from the other side, ordinary neighbors turned against one another. In Punjab, where millions were moving in both directions, violence spread rapidly. Refugee columns traveling along roads could be attacked. Villages were burned or emptied. And people who had spent generations living alongside one another suddenly found themselves running from the very communities they had once known. The railways became one of the main ways people tried to escape. Trains were packed with refugees leaving their homes, hoping that the journey would take them safely across the new border. But some trains were attacked before they reached their destination. In some cases, trains arrived carrying victims rather than the families who had boarded them. The violence was not limited to men. Women and children were also caught in the catastrophe. Women were abducted, sexually assaulted, forcibly converted or married, and thousands were separated from their families. Governments later launched efforts to recover abducted women and return them across the new borders. But for many families, the damage could never truly be undone. The exact death toll remains disputed. Historical estimates vary widely because there was no reliable system recording the people killed during the chaos. Modern research has suggested figures reaching roughly 2 million deaths, while other historical estimates have been lower or higher. What is clear is that the violence killed hundreds of thousands of people at minimum, and potentially far more. And this is what made the partition migration so different from an ordinary movement of people. These weren't simply families searching for better opportunities. They were escaping a collapse of security, often carrying only what they could hold in their hands. By the time the violence began to subside, millions had crossed the border. But crossing it did not mean the story was over. They still had to build new lives, in places they had never expected to call home. For the millions who survived, crossing the border was only the beginning. They had arrived in countries that were technically new, but many had nothing waiting for them. No home, no land, no business, sometimes not even the rest of their family. Across India and Pakistan, enormous refugee camps appeared as governments struggled to accommodate the sudden population movements. Families began rebuilding their lives from almost nothing. Homes were claimed by new residents. Businesses changed hands. Fields were abandoned in one place and cultivated by completely different families somewhere else. Entire cities were transformed. Places that had once contained mixed communities became overwhelmingly associated with one religious population. And this demographic transformation would permanently reshape the region. But partition didn't only change where people lived. It changed how two countries saw each other. The new borders created a permanent political divide between India and Pakistan. While the dispute over Kashmir soon became one of the most dangerous consequences of partition. The two countries would go to war, and the relationship between them would remain deeply hostile for decades. Yet the legacy of partition exists far beyond governments and borders. Millions of families carried memories of the homes they had left behind. Stories of journeys, separation, loss, and starting again were passed from one generation to the next. For some families, the village their grandparents left in 1947 still exists. But it is now across an international border. And that is perhaps the most lasting consequence of the migration. The people moved. The map changed. The countries survived. But the world that existed before partition, with its interconnected communities and generations of shared life, could never be completely rebuilt. A single political decision had moved millions of people, and its consequences are still visible across South Asia today. In the end, the partition was supposed to create two new countries, but it also created something much harder to undo. A border that divided people who had lived beside one another for generations. More than 14 million people were uprooted. Hundreds of thousands, and possibly far more, lost their lives. And millions more carried the memory of what happened with them for the rest of their lives. The map of South Asia changed in 1947. But the consequences didn't end that year. They survived in new cities, new borders, new political conflicts, and in families that still remember the homes their ancestors were forced to leave behind. Because a border can be drawn in a matter of days, but moving millions of human lives across that border can change history for generations. And perhaps that's the most frightening lesson of the partition. A line on a map may look simple, but to the people living on it, that line can become everything.